It's fall 1994, Westfield, Indiana. It's 20 miles north of Indianapolis, past the strip malls, past the cornfields, giving way to newer money, where there's an 18-acre estate on 156th Street called Fox Hollow Farm. Tudor-style mansion with a swimming pool, bar inside, and a private driveway. Fancy, you get the picture. The Baumeisters lived there for 2 years by then. Herb, a businessman, and Julie, his devoted wife, 3 kids, possibly a golden retriever, church on Sundays, and 2 sav-a-lot thrift stores doing well enough to afford all this. And on a fall afternoon, 13-year-old Herb Baumeister is playing in a backyard with a friend. It's a wooded backyard, property backs against thick tree cover. Eric finds a skull, a human skull. He brings it to his father, Herb Baumeister, who doesn't call the police. He looks at his son, without skipping a beat, says, "That's from an old medical school skeleton. It belonged to your grandfather. He was a doctor, you know. They used those for anatomy. I must have buried it out here. Don't worry about it." Eric believes him. So does Julie when she finds out. The skull goes back in the ground. And what none of them knew is that by that afternoon in 1994, his father had already killed at least 7 men and buried their remains in those same woods. The skull his son just held in his hands belonged to one of them. The bones were there for years. Herb was burning them, crushing them, scattering them, but there were too many. Always too many. Now, 2 years later, in June of 1996, investigators finally got onto that property. Now, what they found over the following days would haunt the forensic teams who worked the scene for the rest of their careers. 5 bodies, then the remains of at least 11 people, maybe more, scattered, charred, pulverized across the woods and the grounds of the family home. The same place where the children played. They held birthday parties there. A woman lived there for 4 years completely unaware. Over 10,000 individual bone fragments. Now, to put that in context, the only comparable unidentified remains investigation in American history is the World Trade Center. Now, before investigators could arrest him, Herb Baumeister crossed the Canadian border and did the unthinkable. July 3rd, 1996, in a public park in Ontario. He left a note. It talked about his failing marriage, his struggling business. He mentioned almost as an aside that he regretted messing the park. He never mentioned the men in the woods. His last meal was a peanut butter sandwich. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. Tonight, we're going all the way in. The double life, the hunting ground, the bones, the man who says that he was Herb's secret boyfriend for 2 years and who we now know lied about almost everything he told police. We'll also look at a series of highway murders that started 10 years before Fox Hollow Farm, and a theory that Herb Baumeister didn't just do these crimes in his backyard. Maybe he was working a 200-mile stretch of I-70 for over a decade. Now, finally, the question we all want to know. How many people actually died on that property? Because nobody knows, and the digging still isn't over. Join me for a dive into Fox Hollow and the I-70 killings. So who was Herb Baumeister? He was hiding in plain sight as a businessman, a churchgoer, and a father of 3. Nobody looked twice at him. He wasn't charming like Bundy, lacked the theatrics of Gacy. Herb was just odd. He was forgettable, nervous, and somehow that ended up being even more dangerous. Let's look at his early life. Born April 7th, 1947, Indianapolis, oldest of 4. Father was Dr. Herbert Baumeister Sr. He was an anesthesiologist, so they were from an upper middle class upbringing. The psychiatric diagnosis comes in early. Paranoid schizophrenia, antisocial personality disorder, which was diagnosed as a teenager after a string of escalating incidents at school. Stuff like putting a dead crow on a teacher's desk, then urinating on that same teacher's desk. Escalating behavior. His father winds up pulling him from school briefly. When he returns, his peers shun him and he becomes kind of a loner. He drops out of Indiana University twice and then drifts into a copyboy job at the Indianapolis Star. He had a brief psychiatric hospitalization in 1972. Now that's just months after his own wedding. He was committed by his own father for severe depression. He met Julie Sater at IU. She was a high school journalism teacher, part-time student, older, grounded. She represented stability and cover for this guy. Whether he understood that consciously is debatable. The marriage was essentially sexless from day one. On their wedding night, he actually brought magazines to read, and they didn't engage in physical intercourse. Now, over 25 years of marriage, Julie estimates that they had intercourse 3 times. She told detectives that in all that time, she'd never seen him fully naked. He wasn't present emotionally. He was performing the role of a husband and a father, and by most accounts, performing it adequately enough that nobody intervened. The sav-a-lot thrift stores were genuinely successful. So this wasn't a struggling man. He had money, status, community standing. The loan from his mother to start the business is worth noting. The family still believed in him despite everything. Fox Hollow Farm was purchased in 1988. He moved in 1992. A $1 million property on 18 acres with a Tudor-style mansion, a swimming pool, a private bar area, a long, secluded driveway. driveway, not too shabby. The isolation of that property wasn't accidental. Thick woods behind the house with no line of sight from the road and a family gone at the lake all summer made this the ideal spot. Now, while Julie and the kids were at the lake every summer, Herb stayed behind claiming that he needed to mind the store. In truth, he was frequenting gay bars in downtown Indianapolis, a tight cluster, 4-block radius on Mass Avenue. He used the alias Brian Smart, never his real name, never his real address. He often claimed to be from Dayton, Ohio, to misdirect anyone who got suspicious. Herb had access to Indiana BMV records from a previous job there, and he used them to obtain fake IDs with fictitious birth dates. He wasn't flamboyant at bars. Witnesses describe him as nervous, stiff, out of place, but he had a house, the pool, and the promise of a good time, and that was enough, I suppose. His MO was erotic asphyxiation, but he wasn't a passive participant. He used the game as a mechanism to gain control, then simply didn't stop. Contextually, his paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis manifested his feelings of grandiosity, lack of empathy, and ability to compartmentalize completely. He reportedly boasted about killing 56 people. Now, whether that's true or ego inflation, it tells you something about how he saw himself. He burned and crushed bones obsessively. So it's not just about body disposal, it's someone trying to erase people from existence entirely. The fact that his suicide note mentions everything except his victims is maybe the most chilling data point we have about Herb. This man operated for over a decade where lots of men were disappearing. Families were asking questions, and for years, nada. Now let's take a look at the hunting ground and how this guy operated. Early 90s Indianapolis, this was pre-internet, so no apps, no Craigslist, no way to screen who you were going to be going home with. You met somebody at a bar and made a judgment call. The community knew something was wrong before police did. Gay magazines in Indianapolis were publishing warnings as early as the late 80s, urging men to be careful who they left the bars with. The community was sounding the alarm and sadly being largely ignored. By the summer of 93, it became undeniable. Multiple men vanishing nights after nights from the same bars, the same general area, the same profile. The pattern's almost textbook. White males, ages 15 to 46, similar build, all connected to the LGBTQ community, all seen in and around a handful of bars within a 2-block radius. A number of key victims include Johnny Bear, 20, disappeared May 28, 1993. Jeffrey Allen Jones, 23, disappeared July 6, 1993. Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr., 20, disappeared July 31st, 1993. Alan Lee Livingston, 27, disappeared August 6, 93. His remains were recovered in 96, but not identified until October 2023, 30 years later. There was Roger Goodyear, 33, last seen July 22nd, 1994, getting into a vehicle in downtown Indianapolis. He had a mustache, he frequented gay bars, and had multiple arrests for prostitution. His missing status was eventually changed to homicide. And there's Michael Kern, 45, disappeared March 31st, 1995. A jacket believed to be his was later recovered from Baumeister's residence. And that's just 6 of many. And families reported these men missing. They were told essentially that gay men who go home with strangers take risks. And private investigator Virgil Vandegraff, retired Marion County Sheriff, starts getting calls from desperate families in 1994 because police won't engage. The families of Alan Wayne Boussard and Roger Goodyear hire Vandegraff independently. It boils down to civilians doing what law enforcement would not. Now, IPD Detective Mary Wilson is one of the few officers who takes it seriously, and she becomes central to eventually cracking the case wide open. He wasn't randomly hunting. He was methodical and patient. He'd go to the bars. The 501 Club is specifically named in multiple accounts. He presents himself as wealthy, interesting older man with a mansion and a pool. The offer is always the same. Come back to my place. We have a pool to ourselves. I have a bar. It'll be a good night. The alias Brian Smart served multiple purposes. No last name to look up, no connection to Westfield, no trail, and the Dayton, Ohio misdirection speaks for itself. He told men that he was associated with Dayton, planting false geography in case anyone ever asked questions. The fake BMV identification allowed him to present credentials that didn't match his real identity. For a man meeting strangers at bars, this was gold. Once at Fox Hollow Farm, the isolation did the rest. No neighbors within earshot, thick woods, the family gone for the summer. You get the picture. The pool area had a bar, mood lighting, And weirdly enough, mannequins posed around the pool as if socializing, like a woman reaching into a cabinet, a lifeguard, others just standing there. Weird stuff. Not sure what you think the mannequins suggest psychologically, but perhaps this was staging his own fantasy, like a way to make the victims feel at ease in a populated looking space. Or maybe it was something darker about how he saw people. His method of killing, as we said, was erotic asphyxiation. It was initiated in the pool. He'd introduce it as a mutual game. He would walk the victim through it, establish trust, then reverse roles and simply not stop. Now, I think the water element is significant. Struggling in a pool, disoriented, hands around your throat, resistance becomes almost impossible under those circumstances. The pool room is likely where most of them were killed. What Baumeister did next is arguably the most methodical part of the entire story. He burned the bodies, but not a quick burn. He processed them and crushed the bones. He scattered the fragments across his 18-acre property. The ongoing yard waste burning that the Baumeister family did regularly provided cover. Neighbors and families, they just assumed that he was burning brush. And that went on for years, systematically. While his wife and kids were at the lake, he was dismantling human beings in his backyard. The fact that 10,000 plus bone fragments were found and many still can't be individually identified tells you just how thorough he was and how many people he may have killed. And by late 1994, the community is scared. Families are hiring private investigators and a few cops are starting to pay attention. One man comes forward with the story. A man who says he went to that house, he got in the pool, he got out alive. His name is Tony Harris, and what he describes is the closest to a first-person account of what happened to everyone who didn't make it out. But Harris isn't the only one who knows what went on Fox Hollow Farm. There's another man, a man with a much more complicated story. His name is Mark Goodyear, and we're going to circle back to him shortly. Let's first talk about what was found. June 24th, 1996 is a Tuesday morning. Investigators walk onto an 18-acre property in Westfield for the first time with Julie Baumeister's consent. They find human remains the same day, within hours actually. They weren't even fully deployed yet. But remember, not too much earlier in November 95, IPD Detective Mary Wilson, working in the missing men cases, traces a license plate to Herb Baumeister. Now, she and investigators go to Fox Hollow Farm and ask permission to search. Herb and Julie both say no, and they're within their legal rights to do so, so investigators leave. He already killed multiple men by that point. The bone's already out there, and he just answered the door, said no thanks, and the police left. Kind of chilling when you think about it that way. By this point, he knows that the walls are closing in. He starts spending less time at the farm, and Julie files for divorce in January of 1996. By June of 96, Herb is largely absent. He's living elsewhere. The marriage fully collapsed, and the business is struggling. Julie, now effectively alone on the property, is approached again for permission to search the property. This time she says yes. Her motivation was that she genuinely didn't believe her husband was capable of what they were suggesting. She said yes, partly to clear his name. So on June 24th, 1996, the search begins. FBI cadaver dogs are deployed. 2 dogs named Alex and Max are central to the early search and referenced directly in the FBI FOIA documents. Within hours of beginning the search, the dogs alert on multiple locations throughout the whole wooded backyard. And the first fragments are surface level. Some are literally visible just beneath the topsoil, no more than an inch or so down in some places. Investigators initially hoped that it might be animal remains. The forensic anthropologist on scene, Dr. Stephen Naraki from the University of Indianapolis, quickly says otherwise. His initial assessment is that the remains appear to be those of multiple adults, older teens or young adults. The scope is alarming. A search warrant is obtained and the full excavation begins. Here's what they found. Human bones were scattered across a wide area of the wooded grounds, not concentrated in graves, but dispersed as if distributed intentionally. Parts of arms, legs, skull, jawbones, teeth, fragmentary but unmistakably human. Many bones showed evidence of burning, but the critical forensic question was whether burning occurred before or after death, because some evidence suggests ante-mortem burning. That's burning before death. Think about what that means. Bones were deliberately crushed and fragmented, and this clearly required effort and intent. So this wasn't casual disposal. They found handcuffs on the property, shotgun shells, physical evidence of restraint, and potential additional violence beyond strangulation. Then there were the cement vaults. FBI documents reveal investigators knew about 2 large cement vaults buried on the property. They suspected the vaults may contain additional human remains. One was placed in the ground as recently as 1995 while the family was still living there. Now, whether anyone was inside was never definitively resolved publicly. Curious. Dr. Nauraki estimates the remains have been accumulating for 9 to 18 years, meaning that the killing potentially started in the late 70s or the very early 80s. And as the days of searching continued, the number kept climbing. What started as possibly 3 adults became 5, then 8, then 11 confirmed DNA profiles from the original search. Over 10,000 individual bones and bone fragments recovered from the property. The human body contains 206 bones. Do the math. Even accounting for the crushing and the burning, that number represents an almost incomprehensible volume of remains. I mentioned in the very start of this video that it's the second largest unidentified human remains investigation in U.S. history behind the World Trade Center. The bones were ultimately boxed and transported to the University of Indianapolis Archaeology Department, where they remain stored today, still being processed. As of the search conducted in October of 2025, yes, last year, investigators returned to Fox Hollow Farm after cadaver dogs alerted on new locations. They found nothing on that particular trip, but the search continues. But before that, a December 2022 search identified 20 additional locations on the property where more remains may be buried. 10 victims identified so far, 3 in the final stages of DNA work as of August of 2025, and more victims will still be identified. People like Daniel Thomas Halloran, born 1972, identified in April 2025 as the 10th victim. His daughter Coral spent her entire life not knowing what happened to her father. She said, "For more than 30 years I've been grieving the absence of my father. Now knowing he was taken by the alleged crimes at Fox Hollow Farm is just sickening." Manuel Resendez, 34, he vanished 1996. He was identified January 2024. 3 additional victims remain unidentified as of today. Now let's discuss this family's reaction, Julie and the kids. Julie Baumeister's situation deserves real discussion. She's not a villain in this story, but her responses are complicated. She genuinely appears not to have known the sexless marriage, the total separation of their lives, the summers at the lake. Herb structured everything so she would never see. Now, when Eric found that skull in '94 and Herb gave that grandfather's medical skeleton explanation, Julie just accepted it. Tells you how convincing Herb was, or how she unconsciously didn't want to know. The Indianapolis Monthly article Julia wrote in December of 1996, "Life in Limbo," is heartbreaking. She describes going from thinking that they were the perfect family to having her entire reality collapse. The children grew up with bodies in their backyard. They played back there. They had no idea. When the search warrant was issued on June 24th, Herb was already gone. He crossed into Canada, and police and investigators were trying to locate him as the forensic teams were working the property. He'd known for months that the investigation was tightening. And on July 3rd, 1996, 9 days after investigators found the first bones, he was in a park in Ontario, Canada. 1 gunshot wound to the head, self-inflicted. His body was found with a note. We already know what that note said, and more importantly, what it didn't say. The men in those woods were never acknowledged, not once, not even in the end. There's an open wound in this case. No trial, no confession, no official accounting. The only person who could answer the real questions like how many, who, why, how long, that person chose silence. But there's one man who claims he knows more than anyone, who says he was there, that Herb Baumeister told him things. He watched tapes so disturbing they made him scream, and now admitted that almost everything he originally told police was a lie. Mark Goodyear, remember him? This is the most uncomfortable part of the entire case because it implicates somebody who's still alive, someone whose story has changed so many times that the truth may be permanently buried at this point, no pun intended. Mark Goodyear is simultaneously the reason the case got solved and possibly the reason it was never fully solved. He was called a hero, then a survivor, then a witness, then a suspect, then an accomplice. Now, he's been all those things to different people at different times. And in 2025, on camera, he finally started telling a version of events that makes everything worse. Mark Goodyear was a gay man living in Indianapolis in the early to mid-90s. He was going to the same bars as Baumeister's victims. He isn't a young, vulnerable man. He's streetwise, socially connected in the community, someone who knew the scene well. His initial contact with investigators came in early 1996 when he reaches out voluntarily after the story breaks publicly. His original story was that he met a man named Brian at a gay bar in August of '94. He went back to his mansion in the northern suburbs. Things turned dangerous in the pool, and he fought back and escaped. He's the sole survivor. The story breaks the case open. It gives investigators a description, a vehicle, eventually a license plate. In his initial police interview, he said he couldn't remember the directions to the house, said he didn't pay attention to where they were going. What he did remember in vivid detail was the long private driveway, the swimming pool, the bar, the cobwebs inside, and the weird mannequins. The mannequins are worth talking more about here because they're so weird. One woman in a dress is reaching into a cabinet in a kitchenette. One is dressed as a lifeguard. Several others are posed casually around the pool as if enjoying a summer day. It's really weird. This is his account of what happened in the pool. Baumeister introduced erotic asphyxiation as a mutual activity, showed Goodyear how to apply a neck hold while Baumeister was in the water, then reversed it and attempted to use a pool hose to strangle Goodyear from behind. Now, Goodyear claims that he fought back, he forced Baumeister to stop, and then he left. He told police that if he'd been more intoxicated that night, he wouldn't have survived. Now, this story, as told, made him a hero. The man who got away and did the right thing. But let's look at how Goodyear's story cracked open the case. Investigators couldn't find the house from Goodyear's directions, but word spread through the community. A friend of Goodyear's spotted someone matching the description downtown and got a plate number. Detective Mary Wilson runs the plate through the BMV, and it comes back to Herbert Richard Baumeister of Westfield, Indiana. And before this moment, Baumeister wasn't on anyone's radar. He had no criminal record. He was a businessman with a wife and 3 kids. The plate number's everything. It's the thread that unravels the whole operation. So on the surface, Goodyear is a hero, because without him, they may never have found Baumeister. But his story keeps changing. Over the years, through subsequent interviews, through the 2025 Hulu documentary, Goodyear's account shifts in ways that are kind of impossible to ignore. Small changes at first, then bigger ones. Then in 2025, on camera, he admits to lying outright about the core of his original testimony. He admits Baumeister never attacked him. There was no near-death experience in the pool. He wasn't a victim. He now says that he and Baumeister had an ongoing relationship, a secret extended involvement that lasted 2 years, right up until Baumeister's death in July of '96. 2 years. The entire period when men were disappearing from Indianapolis gay bars. Goodyear was regularly at Fox Hollow Farm. He doesn't want to call it a relationship, but that's what the timeline describes. So what does Goodyear now claim he heard and saw? Well, Goodyear says Baumeister boasted about killing 56 people. Not 7, 11, 25, 56. Now, whether that number is accurate, exaggerated, or Baumeister's own grandiosity inflating the count, it tells you what kind of man Herb Baumeister believed himself to be. Now, Goodyear claims Baumeister walked him to a fire pit on the estate where human remains were actively burning during one of his visits. He saw it. He smelled it. He stayed. Now for the tapes. Goodyear claims that Baumeister showed him homemade videotapes, footage so disturbing it made him scream. He won't describe what was on them in specific terms, only that the minute you got a flash of what was going on, it made you scream. Now, these tapes have never been found. Coroner Jellison says that the chances of locating them are slim to none, and Slim just skipped town. But if they exist or existed, they'd be the most significant piece of evidence in the entire case. Goodyear also claims Baumeister once said to him, "He was trying to take me down with him, but guess what? He's effing dead, ain't he?" Is that a statement of a bystander? It's a curious statement. Now for the riddle letter. At some point, Goodyear writes a letter to investigators. In it, he poses a question he calls a riddle. I was never attacked. I am not a murderer. Exactly what am I? Tell me what I am. Not an accomplice, not a victim, never attacked. What am I? This is his letter. What do you think it means? Well, it's one of the most extraordinary documents in this entire case. He's clearly aware of his own legal exposure. He's clearly trying to define himself into a category that carries no criminal liability. But read it again. Not an accomplice, not a victim, never attacked. He eliminated 3 categories. What's left? The true crime community online, like Reddit threads, podcast discussions, YouTube comments, has essentially reached a consensus here. Goodyear, at minimum, knew what was happening and said nothing. Now, at maximum, he was helping facilitate access to victims. Now, he's never been charged, and he's still alive. Now, there's also the accomplice theory. Coroner Jeff Jellison has gone on the record stating he believes Baumeister didn't act entirely alone. There's a physical argument. Fox Hollow Farm's woods are dense. Thick underbrush, fallen trees, root systems, no clear paths. Moving a body, let alone repeatedly moving bodies through that terrain, is extremely difficult. Then there's a logistical argument. Baumeister was running 2 thrift stores. He was maintaining a marriage and keeping up appearances. The volume of what happened on that property suggests someone else had to have been present at least occasionally. The Goodyear argument points to a man who visited repeatedly, saw burning remains, heard confessions, watched tapes, then said nothing for 2 years while men kept disappearing. Again, is that a passive figure? It's not for me to judge. The counter-argument is that Goodyear's story has changed so many times, investigators genuinely don't know which version to believe. He may be protecting himself legally with every new revision. He may be an attention seeker who escalates his claims. Maybe he's telling the complete truth now and was lying in the earlier versions. Reddit's dominant theory, and it's hard to argue with, is that Goodyear is essentially pleading the fifth in public. Every statement he makes is carefully constructed to admit culpability in ways that don't constitute criminal confessions. Curious. Or maybe not. Again, we got to go back to the mannequins. There's this theory about them. The mannequins have never been fully explained and deserve another moment here. Why does a man have posed mannequins in his pool room, dressed and positioned as if socializing? Now, one theory is that they were props to make the victims feel more comfortable arriving at a party with people already there, only realizing once inside that the people weren't real. Kind of reminds me of the Home Alone argument. Another theory is that they reflect Baumeister's psychological relationship with control. The mannequins are people who can't resist, leave, or accuse him. A darker theory is that they may have been used in the filming of the tapes, like staged scenes. Now, none of this is confirmed, but all of it is worth raising. There's no legal mechanism to charge someone with knowing about murders if you can't prove participation. Now, Goodyear solved the case and may have helped enable it simultaneously. That's the legacy he carries. But Goodyear and Fox Hollow Farm are only half the story. Because before there was a farm, before there was a backyard to bury people in, there was a highway. And on that highway, for over a decade, men were turning up dead in ditches and nobody connected the dots. Until they did. And when they did, the name that kept coming up was the same name. Herbert Richard Baumeister. Now for the meat and bones. Is the I-70 Strangler case a separate case or the same man? Everything we've discussed so far, Fox Hollow Farm, the pool, the bones, that's only the second chapter of this story. The first chapter starts in 1980. That's 16 years before investigators ever set foot on the property. And it plays out not in a backyard, but on a 200-mile stretch of American Interstate cutting across the flattest, most anonymous landscape in the Midwest. Interstate 70, Indiana to Ohio, cornfields, truck stops, drainage ditches, creek beds, 2 rural lane roads feeding off highway exits. Between June 1980 and October 91, 12 men and boys were found dead along that corridor, naked or partially clothed, strangled, dumped in ditches and streams and wooded areas just off the highway. And then in 1991, they stopped completely, as if somebody flipped a switch. Now, coincidentally, that same year, the Baumeister family purchased Fox Hollow Farm. Curious. Let's examine the geography context here. I-70 connects Indianapolis to Columbus, Ohio. That's roughly a 2.5-hour drive east. The dump sites cluster in a specific corridor. Marion County, Hamilton County, Henry County in Indiana, then extending east to Preble County, Shelby County, and beyond into Ohio. Not urban areas. They're rural exits, creek crossings, isolated farm roads, places where a body left at night might not be found for days or weeks. The killer knew these roads, used them deliberately, understood which exits led to isolation. No cameras, no digital trail, no way of tracking a vehicle moving between states. Police in different counties barely communicated. There was no unified system for connecting similar cases across jurisdictions. Let's meet more of the victims. Michael Sean Petrie, 15, June 16, 1980, a teenage male prostitute found naked in rural Hamilton County, Indiana. Michael Andrew Riley, 22, disappeared May 28, 1983 after visiting the Vogue Theater nightclub in Broad Ripple, Indianapolis. Last seen leaving with an unfamiliar man. His nude body was found in a ditch in Hancock County on June 5th, strangled, likely with a towel or a similar fabric. The case becomes critical later because the witness saw him leave with someone. Now that someone was eventually identified from a photo as Baumeister. Then Eric Allen Rodinger, 17, vanished May 7, 1985. Shirtless body found near a stream in rural Preble County, Ohio, that's east of Lewisburg. He was supposedly heading to a job interview later that day. His friends and family denied that he was gay, but investigators found that he had connections to people in drug trafficking circles who overlapped with the gay community. Someone gave him a ride from the bus stop that morning. That person was never identified. Michael Allen Glenn, 29, his body was found August 15, 1986, in a ditch near Eaton, Ohio, clad only in his underwear. Strangulation marks on his neck consistent with a rope. He lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of Indianapolis. He wasn't identified until 3 years after discovery, but fingerprinting eventually made the match. James Boyd Robbins Jr., 21, went missing October 15, 1987 after leaving his mother's home in Indianapolis. His naked corpse was found 2 days later in a ditch in rural Shelby County. Now, 2 witnesses gave conflicting accounts. One described a red Jeep Wrangler near the scene. Another described a Chevy. Now that other vehicle, the Chevy, that later intersects with Baumeister. And even more victims into the late 80s and the 90s, and the pace accelerates as you approach 1991. So the killer's getting more active, more confident, or more desperate. There's a pattern that emerges. Investigators eventually, slowly start to see the shape of this. It doesn't take a genius. All male, all connected or proximate to the gay community, all last seen in and around Indianapolis, specifically that 4-block cluster of gay bars on Mass Avenue, all strangled and found naked or nearly naked, then all dumped in rural areas accessible from I-70 exits. The strangulation method is consistent. Manual or ligature strangulation, consistent with someone using their hands or a cord or a hose. Consistent with erotic asphyxiation taken to its conclusion. No sexual assault found post-mortem, but evidence in some cases of prior consensual erotic activity. This is significant. The sexual component happened before death, not after. This is someone using sex as the mechanism to control and kill, not someone killing for the purpose of sexual assault. The dump site shows sophistication. It's always rural, always near water or drainage, always accessible from the highway, but not visible from it. So the person knew the roads. And in 1991, the bodies stop. October 1991 is when the last victim of the I-70 Strangler is found. Then nothing, just a complete stop. Investigators at the time had no explanation. Did the killer die, get imprisoned, or something unrelated? Move away? Stop? What happened in 1991? Well, I know one thing that happened. The Baumeister family purchased Fox Hollow Farm. The timeline alignment is an exact match. The bodies stop appearing on the highway the same year the Baumeisters acquire that 18-acre private property with thick woods and no neighbors. So the theory kind of writes itself. He didn't stop killing. He stopped dumping because now he had somewhere to put them. So the question becomes, is there any evidence connecting Baumeister to the I-70 killings? Short answer, there's no physical evidence that directly links Baumeister to the I-70 victims. But the circumstantial case is substantial and worth laying out piece by piece. Let's discuss the Michael Riley photograph. February 1998, an Indianapolis resident contacts police claiming Baumeister was the man leaving the Vogue Theater with Riley in 1983. A witness who originally provided a description of an unknown man is shown a photograph of Baumeister. They positively identify him. Now for the vehicle. Witnesses at the I-70 scenes describe vehicles consistent with what Baumeister drove during those years. Baumeister was known to make regular business trips to Ohio during the 80s. That's the exact years the I-70 bodies were being found in the Ohio counties along the route between Indianapolis and Columbus. It's curious. And the bar overlap. The I-70 killer's victims were last seen in the same bars on the same blocks that Baumeister frequented as Brian Smart. Even with all this, investigators from every county where I-70 Strangler victims were found reviewed the evidence and reached the same conclusion. Baumeister was not their man. Well, if he isn't their man, what about competing suspects? There's Larry Eiler, worth a significant discussion here because his case runs parallel and overlapping in deeply weird ways. Eiler was convicted of murdering 21 adolescent boys and young men in Indiana and Illinois. He was known as the Interstate Killer or the Freeway Killer and dumped bodies near highways. He targeted young men connected to the gay community and had strong connections to the Indianapolis scene. He was on death row at the time investigators were connecting the I-70 dots. Convicted of the 1986 murder of 16-year-old Daniel Bridges. 2 days after Eiler's death in March of 1994, his lawyer released a posthumous confession. Eiler admitted killing 21 young men between 1982 and 1984. The list included Indianapolis-era victims, but none of the I-70 Stranglers confirmed victims. The MO differences are real and worth raising. Eiler used a knife. The I-70 Strangler used strangulation. Eiler's killing period was concentrated. The Stranglers spanned 11 years. They overlapped geographically and demographically, but the methodology is different. Then there's Ted Flauschaker. It's an Indianapolis community figure. He's publicly argued that police used Baumeister as a convenient scapegoat to close cold cases before a municipal election. He said the real killer or killers remain unidentified. This is a minority view, but it's a documented one. The uncomfortable truth is that because Baumeister died before being charged, no evidence was ever tested in court, so no official determination was ever made. The I-70 Strangler case remains officially unsolved. Something else worth noting, the I-70 killer versus the I-70 Strangler. There's actually 2 serial killers associated with I-70, and they're completely different cases with completely different profiles. The I-70 Strangler, male victims, gay community, strangulation, Indiana to Ohio, 1980 to 1991. The I-70 killer, completely separate case. 22 caliber shooter who targeted women inside businesses, hardware stores, craft stores, from western Indiana all the way to Texas in the early 90s. Shot them and left. No connection to the gay community whatsoever. These 2 cases ran simultaneously in overlapping geography, which created investigative confusion and also muddied media coverage at the time. An eerie footnote here is that the composite sketch created from a wounded survivor of the I-70 killer, a female store shooter, bears a striking resemblance to Herb Baumeister, and some researchers raise this, but it's never been officially investigated as a connection. Curious. But there's a broader highway killer context here. The late 70s through the early 90s represent a period of intense highway predation across America, not just Indiana. The Interstate system was barely 2 decades old. Rest stops were unmonitored, hitchhiking was still common, and truck stops were anonymous hubs. Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, they claimed victims across the highway system during the same period, though many of their confessions were fabricated. Dean Corll in Houston, Randy Kraft in California. The pattern of predators targeting young men from gay communities in the 70s and 80s is national, not regional. So Indiana wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a broader failure. Some specific failures in 1996 investigation worth noting. Even once investigators were on the property, the forensic response was inadequate by modern standards and arguably by standards of the time. Coroner Jeff Jellison, reviewing the original case decades later, said, "When you look at the original investigation back in the 90s, when the search warrant was served, I don't think we were prepared to really handle an investigation like that. It's a powerful statement. The bones weren't cataloged and processed with the methodology a scene of that scale required. There was a jurisdictional complexity, multiple agencies involved, IPD, Hamilton County Sheriff, FBI, and coordination was imperfect. The I-70 connection wasn't seriously investigated at the time. Those cases sat in a separate county filing system. Nobody was looking at the full picture. Mark Goodyear was interviewed but not pressed hard enough. His story was accepted largely at face value because it was useful. It broke the case open. Pulling that thread further might have collapsed the whole narrative of how the investigation proceeded. When Baumeister fled and died, the investigation effectively closed. The dominant institutional response was, the killer is dead, the case is solved, move on. The families of unidentified victims had no recourse. Remember, no trial, no testimony, no official record of what happened to their people. On June 24, 1996, bones were found at Fox Hollow Farm and an arrest warrant was issued. Baumeister was already gone by now. He'd been living away from the farm for months. The marriage collapsed. The businesses were struggling. He crossed into Canada. He was driving alone. He has money, he has fake IDs, skills, and time. He travels to Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario. It's a public park on the shore of Lake Huron. July 3rd, 1996, a Wednesday, 9 days after the discovery, he sits down in that park, writes a note, shoots himself in the head with that single gunshot wound. That note, nothing about the men in the woods, no names, no acknowledgement. The suicide note itself is the most complete portrait we have of how Baumeister understood himself. Someone who regretted inconveniencing a park. The victims didn't exist to him, even at the end. His body was identified by Canadian authorities and the case in Indiana was effectively closed. From 1996 to roughly 2022, that's 26 years, this case existed in a kind of institutional limbo. The bones sat in boxes at the University of Indianapolis. The case got occasional true crime coverage, but nothing that drove institutional action. The I-70 Strangler cases sat officially unsolved in county filing systems across Indiana to Ohio. Mark Goodyear disappeared from public view, living quietly. By 2016, posting religious content on social media. Fox Hollow Farm was sold and people moved in. The current owner, Robert Graves, lives there and he's been open about the history, even allowing investigators back onto the property. Graves said that the house has a darkness. Ghost Adventures filmed there, paranormal witnesses covered it, multiple investigators reported unexplained activity. Whether you believe it or not, the weight of what happened there is palpable to everybody who enters. Now, Jeff Jellison started up a new investigation. The turning point comes when Jeff Jellison is elected Hamilton County coroner and decides to give it another crack. He looks at those boxes. 10,000 pieces of human bone, 8 identifications in 25 years, and dozens of families still waiting. He makes a public announcement in 2022 that the investigation is being formally reopened and expanded. The tools now available didn't exist in 1996. Things like forensic genetic genealogy, advanced DNA extraction from fragmentary remains, the GED match, the family tree DNA databases, companies like Othram Inc. that specialize in next-generation forensics DNA. The pace of identifications has accelerated sharply. 3 more victims in the final stages of DNA work as of August 2025. Ellison's joined by GenGenies, a not-for-profit investigative genetic genealogy firm, to accelerate the process even further. The Hamilton County Coroner's Office has repeatedly asked anyone with family members missing from the mid-'80s to the '90s in the Indianapolis area to submit a DNA sample. If you know someone who fits that profile, please reach out. Now, official confirmed victims with identified remains hangs at 10. Additional unidentified remains confirmed as homicide victims at 3. Total DNA profiles extracted from the original bone fragments, 11 in the 90s, and ongoing extractions continues. Investigators' estimate of total victims lands around 25, possibly significantly more. The 56 figure that Goodyear claims Baumeister boasted about is still unverified, but not dismissible. The I-70 Strangler victims officially attributed to him are 12, though the case remains unsolved. So if you combine the conservative Fox Hollow count and the I-70 attribution, you're looking at a potential victim count that exceeds John Wayne Gacy and approaches or even surpasses Jeffrey Dahmer. Herb Baumeister may be one of the 5 most prolific serial killers in American history, and he's simultaneously the most under-recognized. Why is that? I can only speculate that perhaps it's the same reason the case was never taken seriously in the first place. It's the nature of his victims. We have some questions. The tapes, do they exist? Were they destroyed? Are they somewhere in Canada, in a storage unit, in a dumpster? Nobody seems to know. Mark Goodyear is still alive. His final version of events still internally contradictory. Will he ever be charged with anything? Almost certainly not. Does he know things that died with Baumeister? Almost certainly yes. The unidentified 3, who are they? Somewhere there are families who don't know that their loved ones are in boxes at the University of Indianapolis. The coroner is asking for DNA. The ask is real and ongoing. The I-70 cases are officially unsolved. The families of those 12 men have even less closure than the Fox Hollow families because their cases were never officially formally attributed. What's under the ground at Fox Hollow Farm that hasn't been found yet? Rob Grave lives on that property, and he knows more searches are coming. That 56 number, if Baumeister's telling the truth to Goodyear, if there are 56 victims, where are the other 30 or so? Are some of them the I-70's victims? Are some in locations nobody looked? Are some in Ohio? We don't know, and we may never know. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.